Waitress can't afford rent, then Neymar leaves a life-changing tip. The restaurant was buzzing with life, filled with the clinking of glasses, murmured conversations, and the occasional burst of laughter from well-dressed patrons. Olivia moved through the maze of tables, her tray balanced carefully on one arm as she served yet another round of drinks to a group that had barely acknowledged her existence all night. Her feet ached, her head pounded, and her stomach twisted with the familiar pang of hunger. She had been too busy to eat today again. There hadn't been time, not between working a double shift and trying to figure out how she was going to come up with the rest of her rent money by the end of the week. She pasted on a tired but polite smile as she approached a table near the window, where a man sat alone, his hood pulled low over his face. He was dressed simply, too simply for the kind of crowd that usually came here, but there was something about him that made him stand out. Not in an obvious way, but in a way that Olivia's instincts picked up on. He wasn't like the others. She forced her exhaustion aside and approached with practiced ease. "Good evening. Can I get you something to drink while you look over the menu?" The man lifted his head slightly, and for the first time she caught a glimpse of his face. Dark brown eyes, a strong jawline, a face that was somehow familiar yet out of place in a restaurant like this. He smiled, and it was a lazy, easy kind of smile, the kind that hinted at someone who was used to being recognized. "Just water for now," he said, his voice smooth and relaxed. Olivia nodded, noting the slight accent in his tone. She turned to grab his drink, but as she walked away, something nagged at the back of her mind. She had seen that face before. By the time she returned with his water, he had closed the menu. "I'll take whatever you recommend," he said, pushing it aside. She blinked. Most customers here had very specific requests. The wealthy elite didn't usually leave their meals to chance. "Are you sure?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. He chuckled, leaning back in his chair. "I trust you." Something about the way he said it made warmth bloom in her chest. She wasn't used to being trusted. She nodded, jotting down the order before hurrying off to put it in. The rest of her shift blurred together. Rude customers, Greg breathing down her neck, the stress of knowing she didn't have enough money for rent. But through it all, she kept glancing back at table 7. The man was calm, patient, completely unbothered by the chaos of the restaurant. He didn't rush her, didn't demand attention the way the other high-profile guests did. He just waited. When his food arrived, he ate slowly, seeming to enjoy every bite. And when he finally finished, he waved her over. "That was perfect," he said, flashing her another easy grin. "You've got good taste." Olivia felt a small flicker of pride but brushed it aside. "Glad you liked it. Can I get you anything else?" He shook his head. "Just the bill?" She nodded, hurrying off to ring him up, and by the time she returned, he was already gone. Her stomach twisted. That was always a bad sign. People who left without waiting for the check usually meant one of two things: they had an emergency or they had skipped out on the bill. She snatched up the receipt quickly, bracing herself for the worst. But then her breath caught in her throat. She blinked. Then blinked again. There, neatly stacked under the bill, was a pile of crisp $100 bills. $1,000. Her hands trembled as she picked them up, her eyes scanning the receipt for some kind of mistake. And then she saw it. At the bottom of the check, scribbled in casual, almost careless handwriting, was a note. "For the kind waitress. You deserve more. Neymar." Her heart nearly stopped. Neymar. As in Neymar. The world-famous footballer. The man whose face was on billboards, who had millions of fans, who lived a life so far removed from hers that she never could have imagined crossing paths with him. And yet, he had been sitting at her table this whole time. And he had seen her. Not just as a waitress. Not just as someone running around taking orders and balancing trays. He had seen her. Her knees felt weak as she clutched the money, the weight of it pressing against her chest like something too big to hold. She had worked herself to the bone for tips that barely covered her groceries. She had scraped together pennies, gone without meals, and pushed herself to exhaustion, all while customers barely acknowledged her existence. And then in one night, one stranger had changed everything. She swallowed hard, blinking back the sting in her eyes. For the first time in years, she didn't feel invisible. She felt seen. And she had no idea what to do with that. She tucked the money carefully into her pocket, her hands still shaking as she turned back toward the kitchen. The restaurant continued as if nothing had happened. As if her world hadn't just been turned upside down. But she knew the truth. Nothing would ever be the same again. The money felt heavier in Olivia's pocket than it should have. As if it wasn't just bills but a shift in her entire reality. She moved through the rest of her shift in a haze, barely aware of the customers she served, the conversations happening around her, or even Greg's usual barking orders. because something had changed. She wasn't sure how to process it yet, but she knew this wasn't just about the money. This was about the fact that someone like Neymar had noticed her, had seen past the tired waitress uniform, past the exhaustion on her face, past the robotic pleasantries she had perfected over the years. He had seen something in her that she had almost forgotten herself, that she was worth more than this. She didn't know what to do with that feeling. As soon as her shift ended, she slipped out the back door of the restaurant and started walking home, the cold night air biting against her skin. The city was still alive, horns honking, lights flashing, people moving, but Olivia felt like she was trapped inside a bubble, disconnected from the world around her. She pulled out the crisp bills once she reached her apartment, setting them carefully on the small, wobbly table in her kitchen. The edges were smooth, untouched by struggle, unlike every dollar she had ever earned. $1,000. More than 2 weeks of work. She could breathe for the first time in a long time. But instead of relief, she felt something else entirely. A question. Why had he done this? Why her? She had served hundreds of customers over the years. People richer than Neymar, people who threw money around like it meant nothing, people who barely acknowledged she existed. But none of them had ever seen her. None of them had stopped to say, "You deserve better." She picked up her phone, hesitated, then typed into the search bar. Neymar New York sightings. Headlines popped up instantly. Neymar spotted in New York ahead of charity event. Football star lays low in the city before upcoming match. Her stomach tightened. So he hadn't just been some lost tourist stopping in for a meal. He had been in the city for a reason. And yet, somehow, in the middle of all that, he had noticed her. She leaned back in her chair, staring at the ceiling. She had spent so much of her life waiting tables, feeling invisible, believing that people like Neymar lived in an entirely different universe. A universe she would never be a part of. But now she wasn't so sure. Because tonight had proven something she had never dared to believe. That the universe had noticed her back. And for the first time in years she wondered, what if she was meant for more? The money sat untouched on Olivia's kitchen table, the edges still crisp, still carrying the weight of something too big to be real. She hadn't slept. Every time she closed her eyes, the night replayed in her mind, the lazy smile, the warmth in Neymar's gaze, the way he had casually handed her more money than she had ever seen at once as if it were nothing. But it wasn't nothing. Not to her. It was everything. Her rent was due in 3 days. Normally she'd be in a panic by now, triple-checking her tips, trying to scrape together whatever she could. But now, she could pay it today. She should have felt relief. Instead, she felt something else entirely. Because now, a new question had settled in her mind, one she couldn't shake no matter how hard she tried. What if this wasn't just about rent? What if this was about something bigger? For years, she had told herself that she had no options, that she was stuck, that this was her life and it would always be this way. But Neymar had seen something different. She didn't know why, didn't know what it was that had made him stop, that had made him decide that she was worth helping. But maybe that wasn't the point. Maybe the point was that he had. And maybe, just maybe, he was right. She grabbed her phone, her heart pounding as she did something she hadn't done in years. She searched for college applications. She had always wanted to go. Had always dreamed of something bigger. But life had gotten in the way. Bills. Work. The constant grind of trying to stay afloat. She had told herself that she would do it someday. But someday had never come. Because she had never let it. Now, staring at the screen, seeing the application staring back at her, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. One application. One shot. She could do this. Because for the first time she believed she could. She took a deep breath. And then, she clicked apply. And just like that, her life changed forever. Olivia's hands trembled as she stared at the confirmation screen. The application had been sent. There was no turning back now. A wave of emotions crashed over her. Relief, terror, excitement, doubt. Had she really done this? Had she really just taken a step toward something bigger? Something she had convinced herself wasn't meant for people like her? For so long she had felt trapped. She had told herself that working endless shifts, struggling to make rent, and living paycheck to paycheck was just how life worked. That dreaming was for other people. People with money. People who weren't constantly exhausted. People like Neymar. But last night had changed something. He had seen her, had looked at her like she was worth more than the life she was barely surviving. And for the first time she had let herself believe it. She leaned back in her chair, staring at the stack of bills on her table. $1,000. It was enough to pay her rent. Enough to buy groceries. Maybe even enough to let her breathe for a moment. But it was also enough to start over. Her phone buzzed, jolting her from her thoughts. It was a text from her landlord. "Your rent is due tomorrow. No extensions." She exhaled slowly. She should have expected that. Callahan wasn't known for being patient. She grabbed the money, stuffing it into an envelope. This was the responsible choice. She would go pay it. Then she would start saving little by little for school. She would still have to work, still have to struggle, but for the first time, there was a light at the end of the tunnel. She pulled on her jacket, clutching the envelope tightly as she stepped out onto the city streets. The air was cold, but she barely felt it. Because today she wasn't just walking to drop off her rent. She was walking toward something more. As she made her way toward Callahan's building, her thoughts drifted back to Neymar. Would she ever see him again? Would he ever know what he had done for her? And did it even matter? Because the truth was, he had already given her something no amount of money could. A reason to believe in herself. By the time she reached Callahan's office, she felt different. She knocked, waiting for his usual gruff voice to call her in. When the door swung open, Callahan barely looked up from his desk. "If you're here to ask for an extension?" "I have it," Olivia cut in, her voice stronger than she expected. He blinked, clearly surprised. "You do?" She set the envelope on the desk. "Count it if you want." Callahan opened the flap, his greedy fingers flipping through the crisp bills. He let out a grunt of approval. "About time," he muttered. Olivia should have been furious. Should have been insulted by the way he dismissed the fact that she had just worked herself half to death to get this money. But she wasn't. Because this was the last time. The last time she would feel like she had no other options. She turned to leave, but before she stepped out, she paused. "Next month," she said, glancing back, "someone else will be paying my rent." Callahan raised an eyebrow. "Yeah. Who?" She smiled. "Me." And then she walked out, her head held high. For the first time in her life, she wasn't just working toward survival. She was working toward a future. Her future. And nothing, not even Callahan, not even the fear that had held her back for years, was going to stop her now. As she stepped back out onto the streets, her heart pounding, her mind already racing with possibilities, she pulled out her phone. She hesitated for only a second before typing into the search bar. Neymar upcoming matches. She didn't know what she was looking for. Maybe a way to find him again. Maybe just a way to remind herself that miracles were real. Either way, she was ready. Because for the first time in a long time, Olivia knew exactly where she was going. Olivia swallowed back the sharp response bubbling on her tongue. She had learned a long time ago that talking back to customers didn't pay the rent. Instead, she forced a tight-lipped smile and stepped back as the woman continued picking at her food like it was beneath her. "Is there anything else I can get for you?" Olivia asked, keeping her voice steady. The man waved her off, barely glancing up from his phone. "Just the check." Nodding, Olivia turned toward the register, her grip tightening around the tray. The weight of exhaustion clung to her body, heavier than it had been in months. Her back ached, her legs burned, and the sharp pain in her feet had long since gone numb. She was surviving off adrenaline alone. But even that was starting to wear off. Greg, her manager, leaned against the bar, watching her with that smug smirk he always had when he saw she was struggling. "You look like hell," he said, loud enough for a couple of the waiters to snicker. Olivia clenched her jaw. She wasn't going to let him get to her. Not tonight. She grabbed the bill from the register and walked back to the table, setting it down with practiced politeness. "Thank you for dining with us." The woman didn't even acknowledge her, already lost in conversation with her date. Olivia turned away, making her way toward table 7, where a new customer had been seated. A man in a simple hoodie and a cap pulled low over his face. He had been there for a while, quietly observing the restaurant. Olivia hadn't paid him much attention at first, too busy handling the wave of late-night customers. But now as she approached, something about him felt different. "Good evening," she said, slipping into her well-rehearsed customer service voice. "Can I get you something to drink while you look over the menu?" The man lifted his gaze, and for a moment, Olivia swore he looked familiar. Warm brown eyes. A slight smirk playing on his lips. He didn't answer right away, as if studying her, trying to read something in her expression. Then finally he spoke. "Water is fine," he said, his voice smooth, almost too relaxed for a place like this. Olivia nodded and turned away, her stomach twisting with something she couldn't quite place. There was something about him. But she didn't have time to dwell on it. By the time the clock struck 1 a.m., Olivia felt like she was running on fumes. The restaurant had mostly emptied out, leaving only a handful of stragglers finishing their drinks. Table 7 was still occupied. She approached again, keeping her exhaustion tucked behind her polite demeanor. Would you like anything else? The man glanced up at her, tapping his fingers lightly on the menu before shaking his head. No, I think I'm good. He paused. But tell me, Olivia, how long have you been working here? Her stomach tightened. She hadn't told him her name. She was sure of it. A prickle of unease crept up her spine, but the man's expression wasn't threatening. If anything, it was curious. A while, she said hesitantly. The man tilted his head slightly as if considering her answer. Then, with a small nod, he reached for the bill and slipped something underneath it. Olivia tried to ignore the strange feeling curling in her gut as she took the check from the table. She turned toward the register, opening the receipt out of habit. And then, her breath caught. $100 bills. Not one, not two, but a stack. Her hands shook as she counted. 500, 1,000, more. Her head snapped up. The man was gone. Vanished into the night like he had never been there at all. A folded note was left on the table. With trembling fingers, Olivia opened it. For the kind waitress, you deserve better. She stared at the words. Her mind raced. Who was he? The walk home felt different that night. The world seemed quieter. The wind colder. Every breath she took felt like it was pressing against the weight in her chest. She held the money in her pocket, her fingers brushing against the crisp bills over and over again, as if convincing herself that they were real. $1,000. That was more than she made in weeks. More than her rent. More than she had ever had at one time in her life. And it had come from a stranger. A stranger who had called her by name. A stranger who had seen her. She stepped into her tiny apartment, flicking on the dim light that barely illuminated the peeling wallpaper. Her stomach clenched. This wasn't home. It was a box she was trapped in. But now she had something she hadn't had before. A choice. She sat down on the mattress in the corner of the room, pulling out her phone. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard before she finally typed. Famous athletes in town. The search results loaded instantly. Her eyes scanned the headlines, scrolling quickly. And then, her heart stopped. Neymar spotted in New York ahead of charity event. The article was accompanied by a photo, a grainy image of a man in a hoodie and cap stepping out of a car. Her hands trembled. It was him. It was him. She slammed the phone down onto the mattress, her mind spinning. Neymar had left her that tip. Neymar had been the man at table 7. Her chest tightened. What? Why had he chosen her? She lay back, staring at the cracked ceiling, trying to process it all. She didn't know what to do next. She didn't know how to accept this. But she knew one thing. This wasn't just money. This was a sign. A sign that she could be more. And for the first time in years, she wanted to believe it. The next morning, Olivia woke up with her heart still hammering in her chest. She had barely slept. The events of the night before kept replaying in her mind, over and over, like a dream she couldn't shake. But it wasn't a dream. She had served Neymar. Neymar had left her a life-changing tip. And now she had a decision to make. She sat up, her hands still curled around the bills she had tucked under her pillow, as if afraid they would vanish in the night. It was real. The money was real. The note was real. But what did it mean? For so long, Olivia had accepted that this was her life. The long shifts, the exhaustion, the struggle to make rent every month. It was just how things were. But now, for the first time, she had something she hadn't had before. A way out. She grabbed her phone and opened the search bar again, staring at Neymar's name. His face was plastered across headlines, sports articles, social media posts. But nowhere was there any mention of him leaving a random waitress a $1,000 tip. It wasn't for attention. He had just done it because he had seen her. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, hesitation curling in her chest. She had to do something. She couldn't let this moment slip through her fingers like everything else in her life. And then, before she could talk herself out of it, she clicked on the university website. She had checked it before. Late at night, when she was feeling brave. She had always dreamed of going to college, studying business, creating something of her own, escaping the cycle. But dreams cost money. Money she had never had. Until now. Her heart pounded as she scrolled through the admissions page, her breath catching when she reached the Apply Now button. This was crazy, wasn't it? Her stomach twisted as doubt tried to creep in. But then she thought of Neymar's note. You deserve better. She took a deep breath. And she clicked. For the first time in her life, she chose herself. The moment Olivia clicked the Apply Now button, her breath caught in her throat. She stared at the screen, her fingers hovering over the keyboard as the first section of the application loaded. This was real. She was really doing this. 1,000 thoughts rushed through her head all at once. What if she wasn't good enough? What if she couldn't afford tuition even with this money? What if she failed? But then she remembered the note Neymar had left her. You deserve better. She clenched her jaw and exhaled slowly. No more doubting. No more hesitating. She filled out the first section, typing in her name, her address, her phone number. She moved on to education history, to work experience, pausing slightly when she got to the part where she had to list her current job. Waitress. It felt temporary now, like a title she was finally about to outgrow. She had to pause again when she reached the essay section. Tell us about a defining moment in your life that has shaped your goals for the future. Her fingers trembled over the keys. How was she supposed to put this into words? She thought back to every single night she had dragged herself home from the restaurant, aching and exhausted, convinced she would never escape this life. She thought about the loneliness, the hopelessness, the feeling of being stuck in a world that didn't see her. And then she thought about him. The quiet man at table 7, sitting in a hoodie and a cap, seeing something in her that no one else had. The man who had left her not just money but a message that changed everything. She took a deep breath, and she started to write. Hours passed before Olivia finally leaned back, blinking at the screen. Her eyes burned, her fingers were sore from typing, but she didn't care. She had told her story. And for the first time she wasn't ashamed of it. She read through it one last time before clicking submit. The moment the confirmation email popped into her inbox, a wave of relief and fear crashed over her at the same time. It was done. She had done it. She sat there for a long time just staring at the screen, letting it sink in. She had spent so long waiting for something to change. Now she was the one changing it. Her future was no longer just an impossible dream. It was real. And all it had taken was one person believing in her first. The days passed slowly, but something inside Olivia had shifted. She still showed up to work, still went through the motions of taking orders and balancing trays, but she wasn't the same person anymore. Because now she had hope. She checked her email obsessively, her heart leaping every time a notification popped up. She tried not to get ahead of herself, but the truth was she had never wanted anything more. She wanted to escape. She wanted to prove she was capable of more than surviving. And most of all, she wanted to prove Neymar right. Then, on a Wednesday afternoon, after another exhausting shift, it happened. Her phone vibrated in her pocket as she stepped off the bus. She didn't think much of it at first, probably a reminder from the electric company that her bill was overdue. But when she pulled it out and saw the subject line, her breath hitched. Congratulations. You've been accepted. The world around her blurred. She blinked, rereading the words over and over, her chest tightening with emotion. She had done it. She was going to college. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she didn't care. She let out a shaky laugh, her entire body trembling as she clutched the phone like it might disappear if she let go. For the first time in her life she had a future. She could barely breathe as she clicked on the email, scanning the details. The financial aid package wasn't enough to cover everything, but it didn't matter. Because she had enough. She had Neymar's tip. She had a way out. She sucked in a deep breath, wiped her eyes and whispered to herself, "This is real." And this time she believed it. She wasn't just the struggling waitress anymore. She was Olivia, the girl who got a second chance. And she wasn't going to waste it.